Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Connecting the Dots, Measuring and Increasing Data Use. This is the second webinar of the series, Beyond the Numbers, Harnessing Data for SDGs, a joint initiative by Open Data Watch, Paris 21, and CEPE. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you participated in the first one, welcome back. And if you're just tuning in, we are glad to have you with us. My name is Sheda Badi, and I'm the Managing Director of Open Data Watch, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our organization is an international nonprofit organization working at the intersection of open data and official statistics. We aim to improve the use, quality, and availability of official statistics for measuring and achieving the SDGs. Today's webinar focuses on, as the title suggests, connecting the dots between data production and data impact by better understanding and measuring data use. We have a great hour ahead of us, and we'll dive into the intricacies of data use in discussions with our three distinguished guest speakers. We will then hear from you, our audience, with our questions for the panelists, and we will gauge your perceptions on data use with a few polls. So get ready to respond to our questions and polls. Before we start our official program, I would like to hand it over quickly to our webinar manager, Deirdre Pell, who will take us through some of the house rules and logistics for the day. Deirdre, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sheda, for the introduction, and welcome again to everyone that's joining us for the second webinar of the Beyond the Numbers series. So 4 housekeeping points to share with you all. This webinar is being recorded, and the link to the video will be shared after today's webinar. It will also be made available on all the webinar partners' websites, Open Data Watch, Paris 21, and also CEPE. So if you want to share with colleagues who can't join us or you have to drop off early, you'll have access to the full hour. Second, on the right side of your webinar screen, you'll see a tab on your control panel called Questions. As we move through the discussion and hear from our 3 speakers, please add your questions in here. We'll then filter and select a few to pose back to the speakers in the second half of the webinar. Third, on your control panel, you'll also see a handouts drop-down choice. You'll find here some documents that the speakers may refer to during their interventions, and these will also be shared after the webinar. Lastly, we have a webinar email. It is beyondthenumberswebinar@gmail.com. If there are any comments or if you want to reach out with any feedback, feel free to send us an email there. And we definitely look forward to staying engaged in this webinar series. So with that aside, the last thing to note from me is we're trying to make this discussion as interactive as a virtual meeting can be. So we'll do this through questions in the chat box, which I mentioned before, but also a few audience polls throughout the webinar. So before we get started and hear from our speakers, we want to hear from you, the participants who are joining us. Shortly, your screen will be replaced by a poll question, and there will be 2 more questions like this later in the hour. You should now be viewing a poll on your screen. Please select from the choices here, and once the poll is closed, we'll share the results on the screen. So the question here is to get us thinking and in the mood for talking about data use. Why do you think data use has received insufficient attention? The skills and resources are not readily available to measure use. There are competing priorities in the data ecosystem, or understanding users and their needs is a complex task. So a few moments here just to collect the votes. Okay, the poll is now closed, and it looks like most people are thinking that the reason why is because understanding users and their needs is a complex task. So thanks for your participation in that one. We'll have a few more for you in a bit. Back to you, Sheda, to take us through the next portion of the webinar with our speakers.
Thanks, Deirdre. Very interesting results, and I'm sure we will be hearing from an expert speakers around these responses. So just a quick introduction to our webinar today. There are many steps along the data value chain between producing and using data, and the impact, of course, from data. Most of the efforts to increase data use historically have been placed in opening more data sets without much thought to how people measure the uptake and use of such data sets. So this focus is beginning to shift now with the principles such as the Publish with Purpose movement, and with a lot of research and work that has been done by organizations such as Development Gateway, AidData, Open Data Watch, Paris 21, and others. So the aim is to shift the focus away from just promoting the importance of data use and towards making and taking actions to measure and understand it. The webinar today discusses methods for measuring data use, efforts to increase the capacity of producers to understand users' needs on one end of the data value chain, and policymakers and citizens to use the data on the other end, and what we can learn from current initiatives focusing on measuring data use. Luckily, I'm joined here with 3 experts who can help me tackle these important topics. Our first speaker would be Tonya Sethi, Senior Policy Research Analyst from AidData. AidData is a research lab at the William and Mary College Global Research Institute. AidData has conducted a wealth of research on better understanding data use. We will then hear from my colleague and dear friend, Eric Swanson, Director of Research at Open Data Watch, who will share some practical actions on measuring and monitoring data use from our recently released report, as well as challenges can impede us from getting the most use out of data. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Muchiri Nyaga, the Executive Director at the Local Development Research Institute. As a non-profit, action-oriented think tank, one of the organization's main objective is to strengthen the African data ecosystem for planning, monitoring, and review of interventions to drive transformation in Africa. Muchiri will shed some light on all this from a more local and organizational perspective. How do we get data into the hands of citizens and people that need it? So with that introduction out of the way, let us now turn to our first speaker, Tonya Sethi. Tonya, can you tell us all a little bit about what we know about data use for development from AidData's current and ongoing research? You have about 8 minutes. Go.
Thanks, Shweta. So those results were actually fascinating, and I guess it's encouraging to know that AidData and all the other organizations you mentioned are actually trying to tackle that complex task of understanding users' data needs. So as you mentioned, AidData and Open Data Watch, many other organizations in this space have been active in kind of shifting this focus from data production to use. Simply because data for the sake of data doesn't make much sense. And so maybe I'll talk about a few of the methods that we've used at AidData to kind of push the boundary and to understand more clearly what this landscape of use looks like, especially in the realm of decision making. So we've used large-scale surveys in the past that have been sent to decision makers in 126 low and middle income countries across different sectors. We've used shorter surveys or snap polls that have been more targeted towards specific sectors and types of people. And we've also used interviews to kind of understand the barriers to data use in low and middle income countries. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about what each of these tools or methods has taught us along the way. So in 2017, we sent a large survey. It was called the Listening to Leaders Survey. It goes out to about 60,000 policymakers and practitioners in about 126 low and middle income countries. The people who respond to this survey are decision makers in the government, in-country staff of donor organizations, domestic CSOs and NGO leaders, the private sector, and a few independent experts.
And this is a rather long survey, but we included a module on data use. So specifically asking people what types of information do they use the most, why do they use these sources of information. And interestingly, what we found is that the two types of information that decision makers say that they use the most often, and they also find the most helpful, are official statistics when you look at domestic sources of information. And if you look at international sources of information, they say that they really value program or project evaluation data. We also asked these respondents what makes certain types of information most helpful. So what are the attributes of helpful information? And the two things that come out very strongly are that data needs to reflect the local context, and it should provide concrete policy recommendations. So based on these findings, what we have learned is that data producers can do two things. One is that they should involve local stakeholders in the collection, production, and dissemination of data. And data should be focused not just on diagnosing problems, but also provide solutions in the form of concrete policy recommendations to the extent possible. To give an example, in one of the surveys, we were trying to analyze which governance assessments are most influential. By governance assessments, I'm referring to indicators like, or reports like the Doing Business Report or Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, anything that assesses the state of governance in a country. And so what we found is that those assessments that usually incorporate local knowledge, whether that's through interviews, surveys, exchanges with local stakeholders, and use primary data collection rather than relying on just secondary sources or maybe expert opinion, those assessments tend to be much more influential than others. We also find that assessments that are prescriptive in nature, as opposed to just describing the problem, tend to be more influential. Now, I mentioned that official statistics often comes up as one of the data sources or types of data that is perceived as most helpful. And we've actually found this to be the case even in some of our qualitative work involving interviews. The year before last, we interviewed around 200 decision makers in 3 countries, Honduras, Timor-Leste, and Senegal. And we found that sector-specific administrative data, which is produced by line ministries, censuses and surveys from national statistical offices, these were by far the most often cited types of information. And not to say that barriers didn't exist. I mean, for sure that these decision makers told us that there are constraints around accuracy, around timeliness, but it was quite incredible that despite these barriers, these data sources somehow seem to have an unparalleled advantage in terms of the scale and coverage that they offer. One telling example was in Honduras, where at the time of the study, the most recent agriculture census was back in 1993. And some CSOs who worked in the agriculture space said that they still use that because there's no other substitute, and that really offers the most complete information that they need. So all that is to say that the demand for official statistics, I think will always sort of exceed its supply. And so we wanted to sort of focus specifically on this type of data. And so this year, in a project that was supported by the Hewlett Foundation, we worked with the Open Data Watch to basically get a much more deeper understanding on the use of official statistics, but from both a producer perspective as well as from a user perspective. So what we did was we sent around 2 short surveys. One was sent around to senior and mid-level officials in NSOs, and the other one went to officials in 5 government ministries in 140 low and middle income countries. The reason for selecting government ministries was that, typically NSOs produce all this data to inform domestic policy making. So we wanted to see, whether government officials are actually using this data, if not why, and to understand the barriers a little bit more. So I'll just maybe quickly present 3 findings from this report and would encourage viewers, to look at the report. I think it's shared with them already. It's called Counting on Statistics. And so what we found, in the realm of data production is that NSOs and their government ministries agree on 2 improvements that need to be made to encourage use of this NSO produced data. These 2 improvements are: data needs to be easier to use. By that, what respondents meant was that there should be good documentation that's put out along with the data, and there needs to be good data visualization. And the second improvement was that data needs to be easier to access. So publishing it in machine readable formats, for example, would be one way to do that. Moving on from production into more the dissemination phase, it was very interesting because ministries said that they would actually like to learn more about NSO data, when new data sets get launched, by being able to register to get email or SMS updates, which is not surprising. I think all of us like to receive information, just by a quick kind of click. And what we found is that NSOs actually use this strategy the least. This was lowest on their list. They focused more on printing publications and so on. And so this is one area where there's definitely more room for improvement. Then moving on from dissemination to use, we were pleasantly surprised to see that actually more than 50% of NSO officials who responded to our survey said that they do monitor the use of their data. And most of them said that they do this using web analytics. And encouragingly, web analytics was also the most popular choice for those people who said that they don't currently monitor it, but they would like to do that in the future. So I'll maybe just wrap up by saying, what can we really do with all these findings that are coming out of this research? And so some recommendations that we've highlighted in the report, and I'll maybe just briefly summarize here, is that when we asked NSOs, what do you need to be able to make these changes to encourage data use, they said that they need technical support from development partners. And specifically, they expressed a desire to increase their own technical expertise. So technical expertise of their current staff, as opposed to actually hiring additional staff. So this is one area where future capacity building efforts can actually focus in the areas of building NSO capabilities in data visualization, the website, publishing data in machine readable formats, and so on. On the NSO side, what they can do is to work on creating a system whereby users can subscribe to actually receive these email or SMS updates. And the good thing about a system, once it's put in place, is that NSOs can actually use this to even monitor the types of data that are being used most often. That gives them a good idea of the demand and the types of data that most of their users are actually using. And then finally, what donors can also do is to, particularly in low-income countries where we saw that there was a huge interest to monitor data, but not always the resources or capacity to do so, work with NSOs in these countries to develop web analytic tools. And particularly, I think it would be helpful to help NSOs choose the right metrics to monitor the use of data and use that information to actually make changes to the website or portal. And one hopes that this sort of a thing would trigger a self-sustaining increase in use over time. So maybe I'll stop there. Not sure if I exceeded my 8 minutes. Hopefully I did not.
Perfect, Tonya. That was perfect, exactly on time and on message. And thank you for the overview of these two important reports recently published, and encourage all our audience to actually look them up. So Eric, now turning to you, Tonya mentioned that official statistics were one of the most demanded data sources for users. That's good news, of course, for us in that business. This doesn't necessarily mean it is the most accessible or monitored. Can you speak to how we can improve the use of official statistics, and even how we might be able to increase our ability to monitor how that data is used? Thanks. You have 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Shada. Thank you, Tonya. That was a great lead into what I want to discuss. Tonya has been describing how we have measured data use at the far end of what we call the data value chain. That's where policymakers and program managers access data for their work. The SNAP poll of NSOs and government officials gives us insight into their expectations of each other and how the data NSOs produce is used. So what I'm going to do now is take you back to an earlier point on the data value chain, the point at which the data are published online for anyone to use. And we're going to look at official statistics published online using a couple of tools. One, Tonya's already mentioned, web analytics, which track where visitors go on our websites, also where they come from. And we're going to get a little bit of information from the Open Data Inventory, which evaluates the coverage and openness of NSO websites. One of the reasons that we're interested in web analytics is that they are widely used by private sector firms conducting business online. So there's something we can learn from them. And in the SNAP poll that Tonya discussed, as she told us, NSO managers said that they are using web analytics or would like to use web analytics to monitor their web usage. Here are just an example of a few of the things that can be learned from web analytics data. How many unique visitors access a website, and when are they most likely to do so? Where do they come from, and how did they find the website? And how many pages did they view? What did they look for? And how long did they stay? To find out more about NSO websites and how they're used, we invited 7 countries to participate in our study, Measuring Data Use. And the link to that should also be available to you on your screen. All 7 had Google Analytics installed on their principal websites or on their data portals. They shared access to their Google Analytics accounts with us so we could follow activity on their websites from October 2017 to September 2018. Here are some of our key findings. First of all, web traffic to NSO sites shows peaks and troughs over the year. Many countries showed decreased web traffic during the months of December and January, while other variations were unique to each country. Peak use likely corresponds to the release of data or other key moments on the NSO's calendar. We found that domestic users are the source of the greatest number of site visits, but some sites receive significant numbers of foreign visitors, usually from countries with social or economic ties to the country. Most users arrive at NSO websites through search engines or by typing in a URL or clicking on a link provided to them. Social media does not appear to play a large role in helping users find websites or data portals. By following users as they move through the website and noting the pages they land on, we have found clear evidence that NSO websites and data portals are not data graveyards. They are widely used to access data, and they serve a vital function in the effort to disseminate data to the public. We also found that economic statistics were most frequently sought, followed by demographic and social data. Environmental statistics were not often looked for or may not even have been available on many websites. This, you should note, only reflects what users who stayed on the website found. On some websites, half the visitors left without going beyond the home page. We also learned some lessons for website managers. First of all, every NSO should install Google Analytics or a similar tool on their website. Detailed guidance on how to correctly implement website analytics can be found in the annexes to our report. NSOs that have installed Google Analytics should check their settings to fix some common errors identified in our report. For example, most of the NSO websites were not set up to filter traffic generated by bots. Those are automated programs that search for and download information from the internet. And most had not enabled site search tracking, which would report on search words used by visitors. A well-structured website should allow the NSO to easily identify and group all pages related to data use and access, but this may require changes to the organization of the website and its web page naming conventions. Finally, we encourage web managers to adopt and use web analytics to improve the accessibility of data on their websites. Implementation of any or all of the recommendations in the report will help them achieve that goal. What else can NSOs do to improve data use? First of all, they should ask themselves whether they are providing open access to all the data their users are seeking. The Open Data Inventory, which we call ODIN, assesses the openness of NSO websites and their coverage of 21 categories of data. In 2017, we found the median country out of 180 provided only 34% of the expected data coverage and satisfied only 40% of the criteria for data openness. So there's a lot missing there. The lowest scoring data category was environmental statistics. The highest scoring was economic and finance statistics. So perhaps the reason web analytics show more people searching for economic statistics and almost no one looking for environmental statistics is because that's what they know they can find. The Odin assessments also found across all countries that 57% of data pages were presented in PDF or other non-machine readable formats. As Tonya said, NSOs still focus on their print publications at the cost of their online presence. We also found that 77% lacked open terms of use. So let me sum up. Our study of web analytics has demonstrated an important method for monitoring data use. The results of the study show that NSO websites and data ports are widely used. The largest websites receive millions of visitors each year who conduct tens of millions of page views. But web analytics only record what users are able to find. They do not tell us about their unmet needs. And from the Odin assessments, we know that many websites do not provide open and comprehensive access to the most widely used development statistics. To learn more about what data users want, we can ask them directly, as we have done in the AidData Snap poll, or we can set up other mechanisms, including feedback channels, user response forms, user groups, and expert advisory panels. And external assessments, such as the Open Data Inventory or the Open Data Barometer, provide comparisons with peer organizations. Once we know what users want, we can use web analytics to measure their response to the changes we make. And as anyone offering a service knows, the secret of success is knowing your user. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. And very important note that you ended with, and that is that there's no one size fits all approach for guiding us in this work, and we need to learn more and do more and experiment more and use different methods like the Snap poll that was mentioned by Tonya, the web analytics that was mentioned by you. So it's, you know, we are beginning to learn that this is as important as it is. Understanding and measuring data use is also complex. So we need to all team up together and do more work on that. So let me turn to Muchiri. First, I want to get some confirmation from Deirdre and organizers whether Muchiri has been able to get back on. He lost his communication for a second. Deirdre, is Muchiri back?
I am.
Oh, great, Muchiri, fantastic. I couldn't see you for a while. So Muchiri,
I couldn't see any of you either. It was terrible.
Yes. So Muchiri, now we are turning to you, and you do a lot of work, of course, with civil society organization. How do we get the data into the hands of people that need it? What are some of the challenges or barriers to data use? And how can we take on a more sort of like a user-centric approach to all of our work to help improve the use of data? Muchiri, go. You have 8 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Shada, and thank you all for having me here today. For us, the thing that preoccupies us is how to get data at the point where decisions are being made, so that we have evidence-informed decisions, where data is one form of evidence that people use to get their jobs done. Now, of course, usability of data or of evidence is highly dependent on the job that the people or the person is trying to get done. But one of the things we've noticed is, especially looking at SDG 1 to 5, which we tend to consider the unfinished business of the MDGs, those working on the front lines of those issues can tend to be fairly disconnected from those who end up in our spaces, you know, the data champions, the open data champions, the big data for development champions. They tend to not be in the same spaces. They speak a different language, and they live at the front line of something that's is a pressing challenge, whether it's a zero hunger or ending poverty or gender equality. So the challenge, the first, I think one of the first things we need to think about in addressing the issue of how do we get data to be more usable, and the question, of course, of how do we get it to those people who need to use it, is first to take a more deliberate multi-stakeholder approach. So I'll talk about this in the context of design of open data initiatives. And some of the work now being done here in Africa by partners such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa on making statistics open by default. The NSO community has had a lot of experience in engaging users. In a number of countries, they have sector working groups. They speak with non-state actors, with state departments, with development partners on what is needed for the statistics to make sense, and what kind of reporting they need to, the kind of information they need to provide for reporting and whatnot. But when it comes to open data initiatives, you don't see too much of that, and not to that extent.
It looks like we have Muchiri's connection problem. We will hold a second to see if he can come back. Muchiri, can you hear us? Deirdre, may I suggest that we go to maybe to the next segment and then we come back when we have recovered Muchiri? Go ahead.
Yes, sure. And apologies for any technical difficulties for those with us on the line, but thanks for your patience here. So if Muchiri joins us again, we'll have him continue his intervention, but for now we'll turn to those who are online and hear from you. We've heard from Eric about methods to monitoring data use, as well as from Tonya on different insights around what we know about users. And now we'll turn to you who are our users on the line. Let's see, it looks like we have Muchiri back.
So let's go back to Muchiri. Yes, and Deirdre, stay on, and we go back to Muchiri to continue his interventions, and then Muchiri, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry, it started to rain, and then the lights went.
Oh, well, we fully understand. So,
if I had the data for the power outage, maybe this would have gone very differently. I'd have made different decisions. I'm sorry about that. So
please continue.
Yeah, so the getting data to the people who need it most, we need to have those people around the table or have them represented when we are speaking about putting in place an open data initiative or how to improve usability of national statistics. So taking a deliberate multi-stakeholder approach is extremely important. I think that would be the first step I'd take to getting data be more usable. But the second thing is making sure that those who are working on the front lines of issues can speak into the quality and the choice of data that is available. If we leave it to data geeks to decide what data goes out and what forms it takes, there's a very high chance that the data and the insights that come out of it will not be very useful for people working at the front lines and having to make decisions. So there's that need to bridge the gap that I don't know if I was still online. I talked about this earlier, where you have those working on the front lines of issues and those working on the data ecosystem issues. Closing that gap is a big priority, and I see this on some levels. For instance, when you're looking at agriculture data, on even the choice of how statistics, how indicators are designed. So that a choice of words can change how an indicator's data is collected. And those are nuances that can sometimes be missed by those working on open data as open data champions. But I'd like to probably stop by saying the thing that I see as a big opportunity for us is the need to think about subnational disaggregation, making data available to those who are working at the subnational level, because that's really where the front lines are. Because if they don't have the data that allows them to speak to their local context, then they have to make decisions based on other kinds of evidence, which is not a bad thing. But data can really enrich the basket of evidence that's available to them for the intervention. And I'd like to just connect this with what Tonya shared about the insights that came out of the work AidData did. The NSO is reporting that their biggest audience is development partners to some extent on one of the reports. That tells me that chances are it's very national level data. It's extremely useful for people looking at a country and trying to figure out how to engage. But for those working at the subnational level, especially if the data is based on surveys, the sample might not have been big enough to provide that level of disaggregation. It tends to be less usable. So we need to find innovative ways of dealing with that level where data is originated, so that it can be as representative as possible to those who need it to get their jobs done. And then those at the international level and the national level who are looking for the bigger aggregated stats can continue to enjoy those and make decisions, that whatever decisions they're making with them. But multi-stakeholderism is key. Thinking about the local context is key, and the decisions that are being made and the point at which they intersect with the data that could be available. So I'll stop there before the internet gods jinx this again.
Thank you, Muchi. That's a very good perspective, and thanks for sticking with us. I don't know whether our audience know, but we are all in different locations and actually different, parts of the world. So this is really interesting to bring all these experts and speakers together under one roof, so-called the webinar roof. So we've now heard from our three experts here on screen. Now let's go back to our audience and attendees and actually hear from you and what you have to say, as I'm sure we may have some experts tuning in as well. So Deirdre, over to you again for your second set of questions for the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Shada, and thank you again to all the speakers for your interventions. So as I mentioned before, it's time to hear from the audience again. We'll now share a series of 2 poll questions. Please read the questions and submit your answers. We'll move through both questions, one by one, and then go back to the panelists for a quick reaction on the results. So let's see the first question now. So, which stakeholder group should play a more active role in promoting data use? National statistics offices, donors and development partners, international statistical agencies, citizens, or governments? We'll give a few moments for all the attendees to submit their results. Okay, so here are the results for the first poll question. It looks like it's a split between national statistical offices needing to play a more active role along with government agencies. It seems that donors and development partners play a less role, which is interesting considering some of the findings that Tonya was sharing before, as well as international statistical agencies. So the onus here seems to be on the country. Let's move now to question 2. What do you consider as the best method to increase data use? Select one or more of the following. Increase producers' understandings of users and their needs. Increase data literacy of users. Deliver data in more friendly and graphic formats. Increase publicity on available data and new data releases, and build capacity of producers to monitor and measure data use. We'll pause now just to allow participants to select their answers to this one. just over half has voted, so we'll wait another moment. Okay, and now we'll see the results. So we have a split among these methods, which could be, a good thing, that there are different approaches for different contexts and countries in order to increase data use. But the one that's getting the most results here is increased data literacy of users. This is something that we can certainly ask perhaps Eric and Muchiri and all of our speakers about, actually. We see the next is delivering data in more friendly and graphic formats. This also goes alongside the literacy of our users and what needs they might have. Increasing the producer's understanding of users and their needs. And then last, we have building the capacity of producers to monitor and measure data use. Maybe we can speak to Eric on his reaction to that one based on some of our ongoing research there. So Shada, I will turn it back to you and just thank the participants for their participation in that one and see what our speakers have to say about some of those results.
Thank you. Thanks, Deirdre. This is very interesting, and thanks for the audience for helping us to get more sort of perspective from you, as well as, of course, now turning to our experts. So now turning to you, Eric, Muchiri, and Tonya, I just wanted to hear your reaction. What do you think? Do you agree with the audience opinion on who needs to play a more active role in promoting data use, and also on the methods to increase data use? So maybe you each take a few minutes responding to expressing your opinions on the result of the polling that we just did. And then we're going to go to the audience questions. So audience, please submit your questions in the chat box, and we will be capturing them. And Deirdre and I will be filtering it back to our experts. So Eric, over to you.
Thanks. Let me go back to that first question that was polled right at the outset of the webinar. And as I recall, the majority answer was that monitoring data use might be rather complicated. And I hope between Tonya and myself, we've convinced you that there really are feasible methods of keeping track of data use on websites, or by going out and directly asking users what do they need. And of course, Muchiri made the important point that we need to ask the people who are really using data in their jobs, not data geeks, but people who have a hands-on sense of what information they need about their needs. So following up then also on the next question about what can we do to increase data use, and that answer concerning data literacy, I think is important, but I sometimes think it's one that we fall back on too easily. Oh, if we just educated everybody, then of course they would make better use of data. But you're not going to get people to come to your data literacy classes unless they see a reason to do so. And so what I'd actually concentrate on right now is less on literacy per se and more on the role of informed data, what we sometimes call infomediaries, people like the press who can interpret statistics and present them to people in ways that make them relevant to their daily lives. That's not necessarily a job that the NSO is in a good position to do, but they are in a good position to make sure that the press and civil society organizations and others who have a need for that data are able to get access to it, able to understand it, and then present it well to the public. So let me see what others have to say.
Good. Thanks, Eric. Muchiri, can we turn to you next on, were you surprised at anything, or anything that sort of you want to share with the audience?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised that what I could have put as my high priority on the first question on promoting data use, it turned out to be what most people thought as well. That promoting data use, I mean, pushing, working with or focusing on government, maybe that's not the right word, but government agencies having a big role to play when it comes to promoting data use. And I see that not just at government agencies, but at ministries, department agencies, the public sector. That's where people are making decisions about where to put money, where to put people, where to put equipment, where to put infrastructure. They're making decisions that affect service delivery on things that make a big difference on not just quality of life and livelihoods, but life and death in many instances. And that's where a lot of the data is originating as well. So I think I agree. That for me is where I spend a lot of my time looking as well. So I might be biased in my view, but I completely agree with that. Like Eric, yes, I tend to be of the opinion that sometimes data literacy, the need for data literacy can sometimes be a crutch. People with some basic understanding know the right questions to ask when they look at some data. But building out the ability to understand the realities of that data set that they're trying to look at, what are the limitations of it, what was the sampling used, what was the date, the frequency, all those other questions might be part of data literacy and they're important. But the issue of understanding user needs for me is really key. We have had a lot of data workshops where you train people and then they go out there and then they cannot find what they need. And you have this frustration that continues to build. And the supply side doesn't understand what needs to come out. So you have this impasse where on one end, people who are a bit more literate and the supply side doesn't either have the capability to produce the data or the understanding to produce the data or even the infrastructure to make it available. So for me, that's for me today probably being my top thing, because everything else I think is supported by whether the data is there in the first place.
Thanks, Muchiri. Very important points. Tonya, over to you quickly. Any reactions that you want to share from result of the poll we just did?
Sure. I actually found those results rather fascinating. So on the first question, I was surprised to see that, no one thought that it was the responsibility of donors or development partners to increase data use. I wonder, people who are answering this, maybe everyone's from a donor agency now. So, I mean, I would say that actually, I mean, there was no all of the above option in the survey, but I actually think that there is a role for each of those groups to play in promoting data use. I found it interesting that most people thought of NSOs and government agencies as being the main push for data use, because as we were drafting the Counting on Statistics report, what was interesting is that typically we think that NSOs maybe view themselves as producers of data. I mean, obviously government agencies are using it, but how much is it in their mandate to really push for use, as opposed to just publishing this data online and then waiting for someone to pick it up. So I thought it was interesting that the government agencies and NSOs are both viewed as people who should be taking more responsibility for actually pushing use. And I think for this, I'll probably just add that point that NSOs are probably already overburdened with a lot of requests for increasing the quality of the data they produce. And so if we are to actually have them take more of an ownership in use, that also needs to be supplemented by increasing their capacity. I mean, typically they're short-staffed, and all of those constraints at the country level need to be taken into account. On the second question, I think I probably differ a little bit with what Eric and Muchiri have said on the data literacy side, in that I certainly think that the presenting data in graphic formats is extremely important to get people interested in it, because data visualization, it's about telling the story in the right way. If it's told the right way, then it catches people's attention, and then they're encouraged to actually use that data for making decisions and so on. But with the data literacy point, one thing that I will say, especially when you think about improving data literacy within NSOs and government agencies, I think one challenge that usually we run into is kind of, transitions of staff. So sort of what you call the brain drain. You train a group of people, and then once they're out of that agency, then it's like, that knowledge is completely lost. And so I think what's important to keep in mind is that these capacity building efforts need to have some focus on like sustainability of those efforts, so that it's not individuals dependent, so that knowledge is not resting with the few key individuals, and once they leave, then it's the whole thing over and over again. So I'll maybe just stop with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Tanya. So we are now 10 minutes to the hour, and I wanted to turn to Deirdre to see whether she can read out a few of the questions that we've heard from our attendees for the panelists. Deirdre, do you have any questions? You can maybe give us two of those questions that you have been receiving.
Sure. So let's start with a few that perhaps we haven't discussed. So one being, how do we build data use into processes, principles, or data quality assessments that guide the production side of data? And this possibly links to a similar question on how do we link data use to a country's national development or national strategy for the development of statistics. So this is thinking about use in terms of a governance and process way. Another question here is, and this might be a good one for Tonya as well as any others, a user group or a stakeholder group that was not included in one of the poll questions on who should play a more active role is universities and research organizations. So what role do they play in this mission to increase data use? And now going back to the statistical literacy question, although the opinion of the panel seems to be that we might fall back on this too much, are there any examples of how to increase statistical literacy of users? And let's start from there, as I know we have just about 8 minutes left to the hour, and we can come back if we have some more. But just to quickly note before we turn back to our speakers, we will be answering some of the questions that were not answered now, and this will be shared as a resource as well in the new year. So over to you, Shade, and to the speakers.
Thank you. Thanks, Deirdre. So Eric, Tanya, and Muchiri, we have. I was thinking about a minute and a half or 2 minutes each. If you can respond to any of the three questions that you would like. One is on the examples of statistical literacy. One is how to bring other user groups such as universities into this space. And of course, the important question on how do we build the data use into the production planning and national planning cycle. Who wants to start? How about Muchiri? We go with you first. Muchiri, can you hear us?
I'm unmuted now. Okay. Yeah. So really quickly, one on the last question about a good example of building statistical or data literacy. My opinion right now, one of the best run programs I've seen is one that was run by the World Bank in Sudan. Last year and the year before, I believe, I think there's a website for it, Sudan Data. They still have content there with the self-learning and the data sets that were used. It's brilliant. I think it provides a model that could be explored for scale out to other places. I think for more information, I can put anyone who's interested in touch with the team at the World Bank, who I'm sure Shada, of course, is fairly familiar with, and Eric as well. The second thing for me has to do with the first question that you asked. What was it again? It slips my mind as a clock.
The link between how do we get data use into the production planning and NSDSs and sort of get it into the mainstream of data production?
I think first of all, data it needs to be prioritized in the documents, in those plans themselves. I'm not even talking about the NSDS as much as I'm thinking about the medium-term plans, the agriculture strategies, the gender equality strategies. We need to advocate for data and evidence to become a mainstream part of those strategies, because then it becomes easier to incorporate that and resource it and have it ongoing. And I think this is also tied into the question about building. Tonya, you mentioned building capacity. It can't be a one-time thing. Building capacity for data and evidence use in government has to be a long-term, permanent feature of the civil service. And we have institutions in government that are designed to build capacity and train people, and it's about adding this to the existing curriculum.
Excellent. Thanks, Muchiri. Tonya, next to you are the quick speaker answering some of these questions.
Okay, rapid fire. So very quickly on that first point, just adding to what Muchiri has already said, this is one of the things that we also actually recommended in the Counting on Statistics report, because it's great to know that NSOs do actually want to monitor data use. They've expressed great interest in measuring data use. But I think the real test of that would be, when they work with development partners to actually, build the measurement of use and this focus into their NSDS and lay out very clearly how they're going to do this. I mean, obviously the surveys revealed a few ways in which they can do it, web analytics and so on, but I think the next step is really to formalize this in the planning documents. On the second question, actually, it was very interesting because one of the findings in our report was also that in addition to development partners, we find that NSOs view research organizations, universities, and think tanks, domestic, the ones that are based in country, as their most important users next to development partners. They also view them as being the most frequent users of their data. All that is to say that this is not surprising, because research organizations are typically the ones that are using census or surveys or these very detailed sources. And so I think what's important is for these organizations to actually be able to communicate the findings to not just the research and academic community, but go beyond, so that you actually increase the visibility of this data among other users as well. And so things like communicating that in a language that's easy to use. But also I think the other thing that research organizations can do is to be more active in spotlighting gaps that exist in current data. Whether it's in terms of coverage or timeliness, sort of be vocal demanders of that data, if one can say that. And I think that will also help in kind of building domestic demand and also putting pressures on NSOs to actually make those improvements in the types of data that research organizations and others in the country need the most.
Oh, thanks, Tonya. Over to you, Eric. You have like 1 minute. Thanks.
Well, and that's plenty of time, because the other speakers have said many of the things I would say, and I'd emphasize again now what I said in my talk, which is that NSOs are service providers, and just like any service provider, a commercial service provider, for example, you really do need to spend time monitoring your users and asking yourself, am I giving them what they want? We have tools now to give you that kind of feedback. Really, NSOs should probably have a dashboard up on everybody's screen, and they should cheer every time they exceed the next limit on the number of data users or the number of web pages viewed. There's a lot of possibilities out there, and I think we're just beginning to crack that open. So I will stop with that cheerful thought.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. And I think that's a very good ending to say that we are at the beginning of a journey to better understand data use and also measure data use. But I think it's a very important time for us to discuss it and bring it to everyone's attention and kind of pull all our thinking and knowledge together in trying to solve this very important issue. So it's time for us to wrap up, and we're near the end of the hour. And thank you for joining us for the second webinar. As Deidre mentioned earlier, we would love to hear more feedback from you. You can visit our website and give us, and more information on the webinar is available. And of course, this has been recorded as well. And we'll send the recording, and the supplemental information is available online. Stay tuned for webinar number 3. It's going to be a very exciting topic in January, and this webinar would be focusing on non-traditional data sources and the role that they play in the in the data for development space. I wanted to thank Muchiri and Eric and Tanya for joining us, and of course Deirdre for organizing and managing this webinar for us. Thank you very much, and take care, and happy holidays to all. Bye.